So I think before I start, I just want to celebrate that moment where she asked you guys to talk to each other and you couldn't stop talking to each other. And she was sort of yelling at you from the stage and you were all ignoring her and you kept talking. And I think that it's important to really like embrace that feeling and remember that that's the feeling that we all missed. I mean, one of the reasons we're all so excited to talk to each other is because we were kept away from it for so long. Nobody has ever started a teleconference and been desperate to continue chatting for as long as possible, right? And so I think, this deck is going to have a lot of pictures. Feel free to come closer if you want to see them better. But it's really fundamentally about rooms, right? About the technology of a room and really honoring the idea that a space like this, really any room, a bar, a conference room, whatever, there are these kind of magical opportunities for people to talk to each other in a way that's effortless, in full resolution, tactile, and it's something that technology can never accomplish. So let's go from there. Together for the right reasons, or Get Back wasn't written on Zoom. So this deck is definitely about, I think, kind of being here, being in Amsterdam, thinking about how it is a bit of an urban utopia. I will say that as a whole, Amsterdam has solved a lot of these problems that just are ongoing concerns in London, San Francisco, New York, but hopefully there's some universal truths here as well. So basically, this is what we were promised, right? This was the promise of the late 20th century, that you would have a brief commute in the morning, you would work 8 hours, and you'd have a brief commute at the end of the day. And what we saw was the day expand and the commutes expand, and people started to have an incredible amount of their time taken up by the process of going to work and working. Obviously, in other states it looked like that, but whether it's a long commute by a train or in a car, it ended up being quite extensive. All of this was based on this idea that the employer would provide a tool that you couldn't get anywhere else, right? And so I think it's important to almost relate it to like an industrial sewing machine or a drill press, right? There's a factory that provides a tool, you come to my factory and you use my tool. And what was amazing is that way of thinking continued well into the 21st century. So we continue to act as though the employer could only provide a tool, when the truth was that we were already in a mobile reality that we were just rejecting, right? So we continue to work in a way as though we were factory workers, even though we could work anywhere, and we created these kind of brutal environments like this Facebook campus. Then there was this little coronavirus that showed up, and it did something kind of amazing. Yes, horrifying, but also it surprisingly solved a problem. COVID forced a solution. Our desks came home, and work finally entered the 21st century. And so in a lot of ways, COVID unleashed this nascent potential in mobility that was there, but completely underutilized in what was still a very 20th century model. And it transformed the way people think about work. Their expectations have changed forever, right? Their fluency has changed forever. They can suddenly do this thing that used to be only like the weird guy who worked from home is now, we're all the weird guy who can work from home. And that ability to use that technology changed the way people thought about how they could work, what productivity was, and where they could place their body in the world while they, pump out documents. Unfortunately, it kind of produced this secondary result where all of our calendars started to look like this, where every single conversation that would have been a casual, hey, what's up, in the hallway turned into a half-hour block on the meeting that probably was nowhere near as efficient as that casual drop-in would be. And what we saw during the pandemic was this pretty aggressive marketing from all these digital tools telling you that they were going to solve all your problems, that essentially Slack could replace the entirety of a workplace, or that everything could happen in Google or whatever, greatly over-promising what those products can provide. However, I do think it's important to think about the role they play. And so our goal as a studio I don't work for Airbnb, but I did for 7 years, just to be clear. I don't work for Airbnb anymore. But our goal as a studio is to think about the role that these digital tools play and how we counterbalance them against the role that a room like this plays, right? And that we put them in their right place, that we balance original reality and virtual reality so that we can get the best out of both of them, and we don't have a calendar that's full of a bunch of little green blocks, and we don't have people going to an office so they can get on a bunch of video calls, right? Which is, again, incredibly counterproductive. So our feeling is, if we're going to create this balance, that employers must create something new. They must create a destination. That for the role of original reality, for it to provide that right ballast against this kind of obsession with digital culture, you need to provide something that is literally compelling to employees. So we started this company, Spaces Of, to really set us up as a prefix to a full sentence that describes all the different things that create a destination. It was founded by me and Layla, and just to give you some history, I had a design studio with my wife, Rachel, who is not Layla, but looks similar. And her and I did all these small commercial projects together. Eventually, we got Airbnb as a client in 2013. Airbnb asked us to design the office in Portland, which is the final result of it, in 2014. And we said, sure, happy to do it, but why don't you acquire us first, and we'll become the in-house team. And so then we became the in-house architecture team for 6.5 years. We grew the team to 18 people. Layla got hired in 2016. Airbnb, as you guys probably know, had a massive, massive growth throughout that portion of its history, was doubling every year. So we got to do a lot of projects all over the world very quickly. Then, global pandemic. Then Airbnb laid off 2,000 people, including us. And so we started Spaces Of. And so from the beginning, Spaces Of was designed to be a post-pandemic design studio, to really answer the question, why do we have offices now? What do we do in them? Why do you go? And we started this company in June of 2020, and this language around destination was already with us, because to us it was very obvious very quickly that this was going to change the way people thought about work forever. So let's talk about these Spaces Of. Productive novelty. So the photos I'm using here are all photos of my work from Airbnb, and I think that, as it says in the little blurb in the schedule here, that, you know, for us, it has been surprising to have gone through what felt like a very niche sort of design process for a very specific company, and learned that a lot of these things that felt very Airbnb, belonging, sense of community, lived brand, all these things that, you know, people from European banks would come to Airbnb and I'd give them tours and they'd be like, yeah, that's really cool for you. We could never do anything like that, right? There was a lot of that sort of response to our work. And I think a lot of that was niche has now become incredibly practical and more broadly applicable to all these different companies who are trying to create this notion of destination. Productive novelty. An office can create unique configurations of people and space that awaken the mind to alternative thinking. We must make humane environments that frame the pleasure of collaboration and find a deeper kind of fun in work. Spaces of active creation. Work is more than document making. We can produce alone, but we innovate together. Exposure to others' approach invites the unplanned linking of concepts to create something new. Spaces of mindful consumption. An office can bring us to a place of well-considered meals and meaningful interactions. A narrowing of attention and deepening of the senses that only purpose-built space can provide. Spaces of fortuitous encounter. We can schedule every second of our lives and miss all the conversations we need to have. Like a great city, proximity produces opportunity. So those are some basically fundamental ways of thinking about this. And I'm going to go through a case study here. We did a long, basically 9-month-long project with SAP to try to think about their footprint in Northern California. And I'm going to kind of walk you guys through this process. So I started with a survey. We asked this very simple question. How much time do employees want to spend in the office? And you could break it down like this, or you can sort of summarize it like this. Most employees want to come to the office, just not every day. This response is very universal in the US. I mean, almost any survey you see will get you this kind of result. 2 to 3 days a week, they actually mean 2 days. The people who say 3 days are just embarrassed to admit they want to say 2 days. And that, I don't know how that translates here. And again, there's a whole anxiety about commuting that exists in the US that's different than here. But this is very consistent, and we see it across industries. How do employees want to use the office? So this is what we saw, and this is what's sort of essential to realize, is that only 37% of people wanted to use the office to sit down at a desk and work, right? Because as mentioned, they had already developed this new fluency. They knew how to work somewhere else great, and that wasn't what they were craving. They didn't need to sit down at your industrial machine, employer. I have my own one of those. What they want to come in is for different forms of connection at different scales, right? Meetings, socializing, etc. So looking at these two things together, the question we wanted to ask was, how many desks does this office need? Like, what is this base unit desk that we used to think about all offices being built around desk per person? What does it turn into? So 37% of the people coming in for heads down work, at a 60% occupancy, which is generous, would probably be a lot more like 40, but I don't want to scare them too much, means that any moment you have 22% of the employee base wants to be there for heads down work, which means that for 1,700 employees, you need 374 desks. And so taking them down to this real acknowledgement, that people's expectations had transformed and what they were coming in for was not desks, was the first step of this process. The next step was to say, okay, what happens with the rest of that space, right? Like suddenly we've opened up this incredible amount of square footage. Another apology in this deck is that there will be area measurements. They will be in square footage. I'm sorry, we're savages. I'm not proud of it. I didn't have the chance to translate it all, but you can move the 0 over 1 and make it back into meters. Okay, so first we did is we analyzed the way the programming was broken down. And what you see and what you saw in most offices, and still true today, whether or not they're being used this way, is that the bulk footprint of any office will be desking. It is the base module. So you have the classic sea of desks, and then you have space around that serves that sea of desks. There's your sea of desks. So we imagined, okay, you have 1,700 employees in the region. How would we service them? And the question they asked was, can you take these employees that work across these 9 buildings on our Palo Alto campus, and could we fit them into just 3 buildings? And so that was the first basic math we did, was just to put them all in there. What we got was 130 square feet per employee, which is tight, but by Silicon Valley standards is actually not that weird. It's just tight. So that was the first question. Yes, we could do that. If theoretically you just want to change nothing but get rid of 6 of your 9 buildings, you guys could all just work in these 3 buildings. If every single employee came to building 1, 2, and 3, they could still have a desk. But they never will, and we know they never would before. I mean, even pre-pandemic, a typical occupancy rate was like 68%, or you guys probably know that as workplace people. So if we look at that 3-day-a-week schedule, plus that 37% heads down work, suddenly you have 595 square feet per employee across this floor plate, right? This incredible allocation of space that theoretically, you could just make a bunch of studio apartments. Like you could just split that up into a bunch of private offices if you wanted to. But in the current format, you get a distribution like this. You get a sea of desks with this, this very light sprinkling of people across the floor plate that ends up with a 14% utilization, which in plan looks like this, but in lived experience looks like that. And this is something that is common across the US, that basically offices kind of look like it's Sunday all the time, and that there's like one guy who is missing some documents or something and had to come in on the weekend to try to find them. And so this experience is experience that no one will come back to, right? So it starts bad and then it gets worse because everybody who has this experience is like, there's no reason to be in the office, I'll just stay home. With 3 buildings in this layout, it will be a ghost town. So what we did is we broke it up into its components, right? We wanted to look at this in a more abstract way. How much of this is desking? How much is collaboration? Can we combine that into a more generous block and really think about the distribution of this program? From there, we thought, okay, we just need to sort of change that ratio substantially, reduce the amount of red, introduce something else that exists in between sort of casual and formal workspace, and then have a whole new set of flexible space for additional programming. So that got them convinced about the nature of their buildings and the ability to shrink them. But as I said, commutes are the things that really freak people out. That's the reason. I mean, if you talk to anybody in one of these dense, large urban environments, and you say, "What do you think of working from home?" They'll be like, "I don't know, it's okay, but I don't miss the commute," right? And the commute ends up producing so much anxiety that people won't even try. So our thought was, how do we analyze this commute and take some of these people were, basically having 13 hours of their day dedicated to work between driving and working and driving again. And can we time shift those commutes so that you're off-peak hours when you're traveling, and instead of thinking about hybrid work as being, today is my in-office day, tomorrow is my home day, think about hybrid work as something more malleable, something that can introduce time shifting inside of a day. So you can augment the time that you would spend in the office with the time you would spend at home, shrink the commute, have like a better, more healthy workflow across the board, and spend way less time in a car. For this to happen, right, it means that SAP has to open the office earlier. They have to close the office later. They have to accommodate people so they can work differently. And for international companies, it's weird that they don't, if you think about it, right? I mean, these are people who are on the phone with Germany every day, right? And so they're calling at 5 a.m. or something from their houses, and then they go to work. But what if they could just go to work and have like coffee and pastry ready for them and start working at work and then go home early, go home at 2 or whatever, their workday is done. Not yet. So next we did interviews. And this was meant to just sort of double check the survey data, right? So you want to, when you approach these kinds of design processes, you want to make sure that you're both asking the questions in an abstract way and ask them in a personal way. Just as a, the interview process here was like a 2-month-long process, but this is a highly compressed version of all this presentation. But what the interviews revealed was this more nuanced, more specific way to think about relationships across the company. That you had your direct team, your extended team, adjacent teams, functional communities and extended networks. So you can imagine that being like an LGB group or the Black SAP workers might have some sort of group that they come together. And there's a way that people need to build secondary communities outside of their team in these companies. Clients and partners, and then a company-wide connection. So what we did is we connected these relationship models through the notion of persona. The personas are about attitudes, not demographics, representative rather than comprehensive, focus on the distinct ways people use physical space. So essentially we created these characters, right? And for each of the character, almost like creating a role-playing game, we gave them a stat chart, right? And we sort of fed that information based on the kind of relationships that they would likely have on their career point, right? So here we have an early talent. When you're new at a company, your direct collaborator is incredibly important, especially if there's a mentorship culture, right? Because you need to be taught directly how to do your job and what's expected of you, and really shown the ropes. Adjacent teams, not so much. You're new. You're still sort of learning about your own team. Functional extended, that's part of you feeling like you're connected to a broader community that exists outside. So once we established these persona, we created a storyboard, and we started to walk them through what we imagined would be their day. So what would you encounter? Like, what would be the optimal lived experience of a person in this position? As you can see, the text is blurred out just because there's a lot of text. But you walk into a space that's gracious, that's social, that immediately is welcoming. You connect to technology that helps you find your mentor so that you can easily get to the place where you need to go to have the kind of conversation you need to have. When you arrive, you have purpose-built furniture, right? So, I mean, from a really fundamental standpoint, desks are like one of the most inflexible pieces of furniture on earth. Tables are the most flexible. Tables can do anything. Desks can do one thing. And so putting a bunch of desks next to each other and people trying to get the heights the same so they can have like a real conversation with each other, it's just awkward. And so we thought, can you make something that's purpose-built where I code, you code, we're next to each other, we can easily engage. There's an acoustic barrier so that we're not talking right into the person across the table from each other. How can things as simple as furniture changes create a specific kind of behavior that this company wants to exhibit and celebrate? Team relationship. We imagined a kind of new kind of configuration for a room, a kind of workatorium that has lounge seating for conversation, but also has sit-stand desks for coding, so that engineers really love to do this thing where they kind of hear the meeting, but are not in the meeting. And this is a behavior that I saw a ton when we were at Airbnb. And this is really thinking about how does someone call in? How do those people engage with that person? And then how do other people kind of audit the meeting? And then desks that are unassigned, desks that have storage solutions that are disconnected from the surface you're working on, desks that are really high performance, that really make an argument for existing, right? If you're gonna put a desk in an office now, it has to be very clear why it's better than your desk at home, or it has to be able to do things that your desk at home can't do. And then programming. So here we imagine a kind of fireside chat. Some sort of guest comes in and it does an interview. So I'm gonna quickly go through this one, the people manager. For this person, we imagine they don't need as much time in the office and they have different social needs. And so they could actually probably have one very intense day that's all about connection with individuals. So they can do their one-on-ones, they could do code reviews. And then we pictured this garage, this room that kind of belongs to the team that can hold ongoing content for the team. So yes, everyone can't be there at once, but the work has a place to stay. And so people can come and return to their ongoing work and see how it's progressed since they left. And it becomes this room as document. And then they also join the fireside chat. So in summary, a destination office must provide a set of experiences that can't be found elsewhere. These guiding principles are kind of underlying all that work. Create specific spaces for specific activities and reinforce their use. Provide spaces to land rather than assign desks. Coordinate team members to come together at the same time. Design for familiarity across locations. Encourage on-site social events and networking to draw people in. Create shared practices around including remote teammates. Run regional locations with a global mindset. So after all this, we finally were allowed to design the campus. So we brought us into 3 buildings. Okay, before I can see you there. I've been doing this a lot with Worktech. I just toured Australia with Worktech, and this happened in Sydney. And I got to exactly this point, and I got kicked off stage. And afterwards, everyone came up to me and said, "I can't believe they kicked you off stage." And they were so alarmed by it. So I will tell you that I have 5 minutes, and I can do it in 5 minutes, and then you guys can see how this story ends. Okay? Okay. 3 distinct buildings without unity. So what we thought was we need to connect these with something legible. So there's a feeling that they're linked in some way, and that linkage itself connects you to outdoor spaces. So one thing, if you guys have never been to Palo Alto, it is like a climatic paradise. It's basically perfect weather all the time. And people spend their lives in air-conditioned buildings. It is like a great tragedy. So our thought was, how do we invite people to go outside and to utilize this exterior space? And how do we make the promenade itself a destination? So the circumambulation of the building becomes something that you crave. There were a few strategies that we put in place, taking over parking lots to turn them into pedestrian ways, creating more subtle linkages between buildings, covering walkways, taking what was a big empty hill and turning it into an exterior amphitheater so that there was a place for outdoor presentations. Various shortcuts throughout the space. So basically there's this notion of paths of desire. People will walk where they want to walk, and turning those into formal walkways. And finally, the big one was taking the top floor of the parking garage and making it into a large outdoor amphitheater space for huge events, and then having them overlook the valley. So after this campus strategies, we got into the building itself. Here we proposed getting rid of the second floor of this building to create a true gateway. And I think this is the part that I wanted to get to. So this is the existing floor plan, right? And this is the kind of brutal sea of desks that exists all over the world from this late 20th century model, right? This is the history of that way of thinking. So our question was, if you just kind of strip that away and analyze the fundamental qualities of this building, the way light enters it, the way circulation naturally will follow that path of light, and then start building out from there, then you can create something that's more humane and represents this time of work. And I think that it's really important that not only is the open office dead or whatever, but actually it's more rooms that we need. As I said at the beginning here, it's rooms. Like, we need rooms to come together and be as people. We don't need these kind of giant undifferentiated planes where we sit alone at a desk. So you see a lot more rooms. So I'm going to go quickly through this so we can get to the end, so I can honor that 5 minutes I promised. Here in this building, we saw a different thing where there's actually a protected green space next to this that nobody ever even looked at. There's these views out, and we thought, okay, how do we reprogram this building to create this indoor-outdoor connection? And again, you know, this fundamental idea that a destination office has to provide things you can't get anywhere else, right? So none of us have like a private, you know, whatever, 4,000 square feet, 400 square meter balcony in our homes that we can go like have lunch on, right? But you can have that at the office. And so how do you make that an obvious feature for people so they know they have access to this kind of space they can't get anywhere else? So all this analysis together resulted in this general change to the floor plan, this kind of reconception of how a desk works and the role it plays in the office. And all of it feeds into this process. And the thing that I really want to share with you guys is that there's this kind of who knows what to do in the hybrid office mentality that happens in a lot of corporate environments. There's just sort of this ambient anxiety. The truth is that there is not an answer, but there is a process that works. There is a way to think through this problem that will lead to a bespoke solution that makes sense for whatever your organization is, right? So it starts with survey data. It moves to a more typical architectural analysis, into interviews, to tactics, spatial tactics, a master plan, and finally that creates that destination that really we all need if any of us are going to ever go back to work and care about work and care about the potential of that work to bring us together into the kind of conversation I saw you guys have. So thank you very much. Thank you for the extra time.